Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. Very happy to be joined today by a new Orbis author, Father Christopher Kellerman, who is a Jesuit priest and the author of this new book, All Oppression Shall Cease, A History of Slavery, Abolitionism, and the Catholic Church. Welcome, Father Kellerman.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's great to be here.
This is an amazing book. I think it's a timely book, and it's also a very disturbing book. And you acknowledge right from the beginning that this is a pretty terrible history. And you also say from the beginning that, a lot of people, tend to make excuses for the history and say, well, the Catholic Church was really always against slavery, or it tried to make it better, or no one knew any better, back in those days, or it was in the forefront of trying to end slavery. What did your dip into this history? How did it? What did you discover about the truth behind some of those kinds of notions people have?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, because it really gets to the heart of the book and my own interest in it, which was that I had heard for a long time that let's say the Georgetown Jesuits or the U.S. bishops who defended slaveholding, that the common theme about those histories was that, well, they were disobeying the Catholic Church when they were doing that. And I always found that a little strange, because it was like, well, if they were disobeying the church, why didn't they get disciplined for that? Why didn't they get in huge trouble? I mean, if slavery is wrong, then you're kidnapping somebody. That's a major problem, right? And so as I started diving into the history, I just realized that was all that it was a lot more complex than that, and it was a lot more difficult than that. And that really, before, let's say, the 18th century, everybody knew that the Catholic Church was totally fine with slaveholding, including keeping people enslaved who were victims of the Atlantic slave trade. But in the late 18th century, and especially during the 19th century, the church, in its documents that started to condemn the trade for the first time, especially in the 19th century when that happened, they started to, as they condemned the slave trade and then slavery itself, they also brought in this new history that was sort of a rewritten narrative that tried to make it seem like we had always been against it and always been against slavery and the slave trade. And those have kind of become the popular narratives today. And unfortunately, they're just completely false.
Well, it's a kind of a typical Catholic argument is that as the church has always and at all times taught,
right?
Things, that could be completely up for grabs. But we tend to read this, of course, very much through a North American, U.S. kind of perspective of slavery.
Right.
And you put this in a much wider context, going all the way back to Scripture. And one of the things that was kind of astonishing to me was to recognize that how, as you say, the New Testament is saturated in references to slavery, which we don't often see because slaves are often translated as servants.
Yeah.
See that they're constantly in Jesus's parables and in Paul and everywhere. There's slaves everywhere. And even those who were in favor of slavery had some pretty good biblical arguments on their side. That Jesus and St. Paul didn't seem to be against slavery, didn't speak out against it, and to combine that with this idea of natural law, that there were some people who were just naturally slaves and that sort of thing. So you show that long before the Americas even discovered, there's this long history and justification within the church of slavery, as you say, that everybody just took for granted.
Yeah, absolutely right. There's I think that what I often say about the Bible and slavery is that it's just a very hard case to make that the Bible is an abolitionist document. There were definitely Christians over the years who tried to make that case and made it very forcefully, but from a historical critical context, that's a really hard argument to make. And what we see is that the church fathers, the first theologians in the church, almost all of them, not all, but almost all of them, found the Bible to be a document that accepted slavery. And then in the medieval era as well, the church really embraced slaveholding and even kind of expanded the ways by which people could become enslaved past that of what pagan Rome had allowed. So you see there really, indeed, quite the opposite of this idea of Christianity coming in and being this on this constant campaign against slavery in the world. In fact, much the opposite. And so what you just mentioned that I think is really important to notice, that sometimes it can feel like the Atlantic slave trade just sort of appeared out of nowhere. And it was just this crazy thing. And in fact, the popes kind of wrote about it in the 19th century as if that were the case. But if it was just this crazy thing that was super racist from the beginning, and of course the church was against it, but in actuality, there was a whole lot of church theology and canon law and church teaching prior to the slave trade that kind of theologically set the table for it to begin. And so it would not have seemed unusual to people in Europe, for example, when African slaves were brought back, when there were these enslaved African men and women brought back by Portugal, because there were already enslaved people in Portugal and in Italy and in Spain. And that was already allowed by the church. And so it's a very strange thing to consider, but it's something that's very important to note, is that the beginning of the trade was very much supported by the church's law and teaching.
Well, even then, when the church comes out against the Atlantic slave trade, that still left open the question, well, what about people, in the Americas who are holding slaves? What are the obligations for them? Is it immoral to have slaves or just to import them from Africa?
Yeah, so the first document of the popes that publicly condemns the trade is Pope Gregory XVI in 1839. And some of the research that I did into that document, because there's a lot of debate around it of was it condemning just the trade, or, like you said, also slavery in the Americas. Well, the documents from the Vatican archives show the letter that an ambassador from Britain wrote to the Vatican asking them to write this letter. And in it, he makes it very clear he's talking about the international Atlantic slave trade, which had already been banned at this time by Britain and the United States. And yet, both in parts of the British Empire and in the United States, slavery itself was still legal. And so with this document, what it seems like is happening is that Gregory is basically doing what Britain and the United States had done, which is condemning participation in this international commerce. And that's one of the things that's really hard for, I think, us contemporaries in the United States to wrap our head around, is that, like, Thomas Jefferson, for example, was the president who signed the ban on the slave trade into law. And he gave this speech about how it was inhuman and evil, and yet we all know that Jefferson was a slave holder. And so they were really these two separate concepts in that discourse. So Gregory bans participation in the trade, but what he does not say in his document is that any victims of the trade or their descendants need to be freed. And he could have said that very easily. There were, it's not like no one had the language for it, but he chose not to do so. And it seems to be because he just wanted to condemn this international trade.
Well, that, brings up an interesting question again about the church in the United States.
Yeah.
Because you could say, earlier, well, you cite various people who were against slavery, from the last, for 1,000 years, but they
Yeah.
tend to be kind of marginal people. And you
Mhm.
can say, well, people didn't really hear that, or they didn't really understand how wrong it was. Now we get into, the 19th century here, and you've got, powerful Christian voices against slavery, but they're
Right.
not coming from Catholics. Uh,
Yeah.
and yet the Catholic Church sort of remains neutral or indifferent, and doesn't really enter into the abolitionist debate, does it?
No. No. And it, it's it, it's a difficult thing, and usually American Catholic historians have often said that the reason this happened was because, the reason why U.S. bishops were not abolitionists is because the American abolitionist movement was really anti-Catholic, or they were too politically liberal or something, but or they were anti-Irish. But the thing is, the American Protestant abolitionist movement, they were more than willing to work with any Catholic who they could. And they did. They worked with Daniel O'Connell, who was probably the most famous Catholic in the world, with the exception of the Pope at that time. They worked with Augustine Cochin. They worked with Orestes Brownson, who was a Catholic in the United States, and Mary Louise Booth. And they published praise of the Haitian Revolution, which by all accounts was a Black Catholic slave revolt. Um, and so I think that what we have to say about the American bishops is that they were actually just really conservative theologically. And what I mean by that is that even though there were Catholics in the world at that time who were on the forefront of the abolitionist movement, they refused to do that, and they were stuck very much in this older theology, which, mind you, was the teaching of the church at the time.
Mhm.
But they, for example, they didn't even celebrate abolition when it happened,
Yeah,
as other bishops did.
that
I
was
mean,
that was that was really striking, the statement that you quote from the bishops. And it's very
yeah,
grudging and kind of disappointed, and
yeah,
like, what are you going to do? I guess here we got it.
yeah,
It's not the way we would have chosen to have abolition, but
right.
we'll do our best, or something.
Yeah. And for some of them, some of them in their defenses of slavery, the American bishops, they wrote just using the church's theology and history, which in many ways doesn't bring race in as a category. They just use that traditional way. But then a whole lot of them just wrote, or some of them, I should say, wrote extremely racist stuff, and we're promoting that. So it's an ugly, again, it's an ugly history.
One thing that surprised me, though, was, if I got this right, that even
Hmm.
after abolition in the United States, there were church statements in Latin America and South America that were still justifying slavery. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Brazil does not. Brazil is the last country in the Western Hemisphere and the Christian world to abolish slavery, and that happened in 1888. Uh, Up until that point, the church itself still defended slavery.
Mhm.
The Holy Office, what we today call the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, in 1866 released a document that said that there is nothing about slavery that is in any way contrary to the natural or divine law.
Mhm.
And in Brazil, the bishops of Brazil continued to defend slavery until basically about a year or two after it was, after it was uh, abolished, before it was abolished, a year or two before it was abolished. And so the church was pretty defensive of slavery all the way till the end, both locally and universally, even though there were some really strong Catholic abolitionist voices. especially in Europe. And then, of course, Black Catholics resisted the trade from day one. That's something I try to focus on a lot in the book, because it's an important part of the history that we sometimes don't hear about.
One of the things that was interesting to me was that when the church then does come out strongly against slavery, it pretty much relies on the arguments and the theology that had been, put forth by like Quakers and Quaker abolitionists.
Yeah.
And because it didn't have a lot of resources from its own tradition, but then it acts as if that's completely natural and not even worth noting what the source of these arguments is.
Yeah, absolutely. Pope Leo the 13th is the first pope to condemn slavery as such, and he gives it. He himself called that document, that his two anti-slavery documents, the doctrine of the church on this issue. And he gives this theological and historical, and in many ways it's a beautiful theological exploration of why slavery is evil, but it's totally straight out of Frederick Douglass and Maria Stuart and William Lloyd Garrison, and really even some of the early Christian abolitionists like Gregory of Nyssa and John Duns Scotus. But yeah, he writes it as if, I love the document. It's so important. I celebrate it, but he writes it as if like, well, everybody knows this. We've been saying this forever. And that's totally wrong. But yeah, it is it is a time, I think, in which theology on the margins, like the theology of marginalized people, became the theology of the church, the official teaching of the church. And it's an incredible moment in history, but he didn't really note that.
The way you put that is very interesting, because again, one of the things that really comes out is the church having these categorical teachings based on revelation, natural law, whatever like that, but without ever really listening to the experience or the testimony of the people who are affected by this. Their witness, their experience is completely foreign to the question of whether this is just or right.
Yeah. And one of the worst treatises in the history of the church, in my opinion, was a Jesuit one by a theologian named Molina, Luis de Molina. And Molina gave the first kind of long European theological analysis of the trade. And at one point he said, well, if you're trying to investigate and find out whether the enslaved person has been enslaved justly or not, investigate it at length, but don't believe what the enslaved person says, because they'll lie.
That's the word that they say. Of course they're going to.
Yeah, because of course they're going to lie, is what he says. And that became a trope in Jesuit theological documents and in others as well. Don't believe the slave. Don't believe this enslaved person. And that is, it's a massive tragedy. And again, it just points to, what happens when there's this shirt that I've seen every now and then that says bad theology kills. And this is a great example of that, because if we had instead listened intently to those people, and had implemented what they were saying, then literally hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people would not have died in the Atlantic slave trade. It's a really serious issue. This thing of listening to people on the margins, it's not just like something to make us feel hip and liberal. Like,
it's just a good thing to do.
It saves people's lives,
Well, that brings me maybe to kind of conclusions about this, the relevance of this story. One of them, on one hand, has to do with how this speaks to the legacy of slavery and systemic racism in our country and the church's relation to that. The second has to do with the whole question of how church teaching changes and what the lessons you might take from that, might be. Maybe you could just comment on those 2 points.
Yeah. I'll actually start with the second one. This history, I can't find any way around it. It seems to me, and I just don't know how you can say anything else, that this was an example of the church reversing its teaching on a major moral issue, whether it's okay for you to own another human being, force them into unpaid labor their entire lives, and then keep their children enslaved as well. I mean, the church radically reversed its teaching on that. And not only that, its theology around it, right? It adopted this whole theological framework. And so, I think that can be really painful for some Catholics to hear, because we want to believe that our church, that it's worth believing in and it's always been right and that kind of thing. But I think that we just have to admit that, Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. And Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, but we aren't. And we screw up sometimes. And we as a church, as a human institution, really screwed up here. And obviously that has contemporary relevance, I think, for, the recent change regarding the death penalty, and then other questions as well that are debated in the church today around, I think, I especially think about issues related to sexuality and gender. Again, can we start by listening to the people who these questions really affect and say, what is their theology? Where is their faith? And that question, I think, is really important. It's one I ask in the book, and it's one I really care about. And at the same time, I think that first question you asked, we don't want to be so excited or interested in the doctrinal change that we skip over the really important question at hand, which is that the church still needs to deal with this history, because we have not ever clarified the documents and said, okay, actually the church issued statements that were in favor of the slave trade early on. And, we've never apologized as a church, and we've never engaged in processes of reparations. And so I think that it's just really important that at some point, and I mean from Rome, all the way down, that we, and I don't know, maybe it's a synod, maybe it's an ecumenical council. I mean, we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade, 12.5 million people forcibly placed on ships, and only 10.7 million of those survived that journey. And then millions of their descendants were kept enslaved as well. I mean, it's a huge thing. And the church basically endorsed it for 400 years. At some point, we have to make, just like we do in the sacrament of reconciliation, we go in, we ask for forgiveness, we try to do what we can to make it right. It's my hope and my prayer that this book will help the church to, begin that process of making reparation for the grave evil that we faulty humans help to perpetuate.
Thank you very much, Father Kellerman. And I can't recommend highly enough this extraordinary book, All Oppression Shall Cease, A History of Slavery, Abolitionism, and the Catholic Church. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Robert.